Well, well, look who decided to crawl out of her trailer park. The words hit me like ice water as I stepped into the mahogany-paneled law office, my 6-year-old son Tommy's small hand clutched in mine. My half-sister Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers gestured dismissively at my thrift store dress, while the rest of Dad's family, the real family, as they'd always made clear, erupted in cruel laughter. My name is Emma, and I'm the daughter my father never wanted to claim. Born to a 19-year-old waitress he'd had a brief affair with during one of his rough patches with his wife, I'd spent 32 years existing on the periphery of the Morrison family empire. While Victoria and her brother Marcus grew up in the sprawling estate on Hillcrest Drive, I was raised in a series of cramped apartments by a mother who worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. The first time I met Dad, I was 7 years old. Mom had dressed me in my only good outfit, a pink dress from Goodwill that she'd carefully mended where the hem had torn. She'd driven our rattling Honda to the gates of his mansion, hands shaking as she pressed the intercom button. "Tell him Emma is here," she'd whispered, as if saying my name louder might somehow make me less worthy of his attention. Dad emerged 20 minutes later, not from the house, but from a black sedan that pulled up behind us. He looked at me through the car window for a long moment, his face unreadable before rolling it down just enough to pass me a white envelope. "For school supplies," he'd said, not meeting my eyes. "Tell your mother I'll send a check monthly." He'd driven away without asking my name, my age, or anything about the daughter he'd just met for the first time. Those monthly checks became the rhythm of my childhood. $200 that meant the difference between having electricity or sitting in the dark, between generic cereal or no breakfast at all. But they came with no phone calls, no birthday visits, no interest in the little girl who waited by the mailbox on the 15th of every month like it was Christmas morning. When I was 12, Mom got sick for the first time, just a bad flu, but she couldn't work for 2 weeks. I called Dad's office, my hands shaking as I explained to his secretary that we needed help with rent. "Mr. Morrison doesn't take personal calls during business hours," she'd said crisply. "Submit any requests in writing." I wrote that letter in my careful 7th grade handwriting, explaining about Mom's fever and the overdue notices, and how I was trying to help by walking dogs for quarters. I never got a response, but the next month's check was $300 instead of $200. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd ever received. High school brought new humiliations. I'd see Dad at Marcus's football games, cheering from the family section while I served nachos from the concession stand to pay for my own school supplies. He'd nod if our eyes met, a polite acknowledgement you'd give a distant acquaintance, nothing more. When I graduated valedictorian, Mom begged me to invite him to the ceremony. I spent 3 days crafting the perfect invitation, handwriting it on nice paper I'd bought with money saved from my after-school job. I even included a photo of me in my cap and gown, hoping it might make him proud. He didn't come. Later I learned from Victoria's Instagram that he'd taken the family to Europe that week for Marcus's high school graduation gift, a month-long tour they'd planned for months. The pattern continued through my 20s. I'd send Christmas cards with photos, hoping he might want to see me growing up. I'd call on Father's Day, leaving voicemails that were never returned. When I got engaged to David, I sent a wedding invitation more out of duty than hope. He sent a card with a $50 check. "Congratulations on your marriage. Wishing you happiness, R. Morrison." The formal signature hurt worse than silence would have, but the cruelest blow came after Tommy was born. I'd sent Dad a birth announcement with 3 photos, Tommy's tiny fingers, his first smile, a shot of all 3 of us in the hospital. This time I wrote a real letter. "Dad, I know we've never been close, but I wanted you to know you have a grandson. His name is Thomas David Chen, and he has your nose. I'd love for you to meet him someday. Maybe we could start over for Tommy's sake. He deserves to know his grandfather." The response came 2 weeks later. Another white envelope, another check. This time $500 with a typed note, "For the baby's college fund. Congratulations." I'd cried for 3 hours, grieving not just for myself but for Tommy, who would grow up knowing he had a grandfather who couldn't be bothered to even say his name. That was 6 years ago. Since then the monthly checks had continued like clockwork, rising slightly when David got hurt, as if Dad's private investigator, because of course he had one, reported back on our circumstances like weather updates, help enough to ease his conscience, never enough to actually change our lives. When Mom died of cancer when I was 23, he paid for the funeral but sent flowers instead of attending. The card read, "With deepest sympathies, the Morrison family." Not Dad, not even Richard, just the family name, like I was a business associate who'd lost a relative. I'd stood at her graveside, watching them lower the only person who'd ever truly loved me into the ground, and realized I was completely alone in the world, except for David, and the child we were trying to conceive. The last time I'd seen Dad before the hospital visit was at Marcus's wedding 3 years ago. I hadn't been invited, but Tommy had been in a t-ball game at the park next to the country club. After the game, Tommy had spotted the photographers and asked if we could watch the fancy people. Dad had seen us through the fence. For just a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something flicker across his face. Regret, maybe, or recognition of what he'd lost by keeping me at arm's length. Then Victoria whispered something in his ear, and he turned away. That night, Tommy asked why the man in the fancy suit had looked so sad when he saw us. "Some people carry a lot of sadness, sweetheart," I'd said, not knowing how else to explain a father who'd chosen pride over love for 32 years. Tommy was born with his father's gentle heart, and my stubborn hope, but also with an old soul that seemed to understand the world's complexities in ways that broke my heart and amazed me daily. When he was 3, he'd asked why we didn't have a big house like the ones on TV. I'd explained that we had something better, a home filled with love. He'd nodded solemnly and said, "Oh, like how cookies taste better when we make them together than when they come from the store." That was Tommy, always finding the truth that adults miss. When David's accident happened, Tommy was only 3, but he'd adapted with the resilience that children possess when their world shifts overnight. He learned to climb onto Daddy's lap carefully, to bring him things from high shelves, to be patient when transfers took longer than they used to. But it was the small moments that revealed his character. Like when he used his piggy bank money to buy David a World's Best Dad mug after a particularly hard physical therapy session, or when he'd curl up next to me on nights when the bills spread across our kitchen table seemed insurmountable and whisper, "Don't worry, Mommy, tomorrow will be better." He started kindergarten the year after David's accident, wearing second-hand clothes and carrying a patched backpack, but his teacher called him a light in the classroom because of how he helped other kids who were struggling. When a classmate forgot lunch money, Tommy would share his peanut butter sandwich without being asked. When someone fell at recess, he was always the first to help them up. The other parents loved him, often commenting on his manners and kindness. But Tommy's real gift was his ability to see through to what mattered. He didn't notice brand names or car models, or whether someone's shoes were new. He noticed if they were sad, if they needed help, if they were alone. The morning before the will reading, he'd been unusually thoughtful while getting dressed. "Mommy, why don't Grandpa's other kids like us?" The question caught me off guard. I'd tried so hard to shield him from the family dynamics, but children absorb more than we realize. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people think that having more money makes them more important, but you and I know that's not true, right?" "Right. Mrs. Johnson at school says what's in your heart matters more than what's in your pocket." Mrs. Johnson is very wise. He'd struggled with the buttons on his good shirt, and I'd knelt to help him. "Will they be mean to us today?" he'd asked quietly. The fact that he'd learned to expect meanness from family gatherings made my chest ache. "Maybe, baby, but remember what we always, other people's meanness is about them, not about us," he'd recited. "That's right, and what else? We can't control how other people act, but we can control how we act back. And how do we act back? With kindness and dignity, even when it's hard." I'd hugged him then, marveling at how this 6-year-old had learned lessons about grace that some adults never master. As we'd driven to the law office that morning, Tommy had been quiet, staring out the window at the expensive houses in Dad's neighborhood. "Mommy, yeah, do you think Grandpa knows we love him even though he stays far away?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Here was my child, extending love to a grandfather who'd never shown him an ounce of genuine interest, who'd missed every birthday and Christmas and milestone moment. "I think he does, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have trouble showing love back, but that doesn't mean they don't feel it. Like when I'm shy at new places but I still like the people there." Exactly like that. Now, standing in that law office while Victoria sneered about trailer parks, Tommy's grip on my hand was steady, He might only be 6, but he was my anchor to what mattered, not because he was innocent, but because his heart had already learned the difference between worth and wealth. The 3 years since David's accident had been a masterclass in endurance, creativity, and the kind of problem-solving that comes when failure isn't an option. My alarm went off at 3:45. By 4:30 I was at Morrison Brothers warehouse, ironically one of Dad's subsidiary companies, though I didn't know that at the time, loading trucks with inventory. The work was brutal, 50-pound boxes of automotive parts and building supplies, but it paid $12 an hour and let me be home when Tommy woke up. I'd get home by 7 a.m., shower quickly in our trailer's tiny bathroom, wake Tommy gently, and make breakfast from whatever we had on hand. Oatmeal with cinnamon if I could afford it, plain if I couldn't. Tommy never complained, even when it was the 4th day in a row of the same meal. David would be awake by then, working through his morning exercises, with the grim determination of someone who refused to let his body define his limits. The first year after the accident, those exercises were agony for both of us to watch. His legs, once strong enough to carry steel beams up 3 flights of scaffolding, couldn't lift themselves 6 inches off the bed. But David was stubborn. Every day he pushed a little harder, lasted a little longer, reached a little further. When insurance stopped covering physical therapy after 6 months, I'd found YouTube videos and library books to help him continue at home. Our living room became a makeshift gym with resistance bands hung from ceiling hooks and a yoga mat spread permanently across the floor. After getting Tommy ready for school and helping David with his routine, I'd walk Tommy to the bus stop, a half-mile trek that served as both quality time and necessity. Since our car had been repossessed 4 months after David's accident, when we missed 3 payments in a row, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., I cleaned offices downtown, vacuuming carpets in law firms and accounting practices, scrubbing toilets in medical buildings, emptying trash cans, filled with the discarded problems of people who made more in a day than I made in a month. The work was invisible and endless, but it was reliable, and reliability was everything. The hardest part of those days was 2 p.m., when I'd be cleaning the children's dentist office on 5th Street. Through the windows, I could see the elementary school across the street releasing kids for the day, and sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of Tommy climbing onto the school bus. My heart would clench with guilt that I wasn't there to greet him, that he was walking into an empty trailer to do homework alone while I scrubbed someone else's floors. But Tommy was resilient. By age 5 he'd learned to let himself into the trailer safely, fix himself a snack from the approved options I'd left out, and start his homework at the kitchen table. When I'd get home at 3:30 I'd often find him curled up on the couch reading library books, having finished his assignments without being asked. Evenings were for family time. Even when I was exhausted to my bone, I'd help Tommy with any homework questions, cook dinner from whatever was in the clearance bin at the grocery store, and spend time with David as he worked through his evening exercises or online coursework. David had started studying bookkeeping through a community college program designed for people with disabilities. Insurance covered the classes, and he could do the work from home once he found clients. It was slow going, math had never been his strong suit, and the computer skills required were frustrating for someone who'd worked with his hands his whole life. But he was determined to contribute again, to be more than just another expense in our stretched thin budget. Saturday mornings were for laundry at the laundromat, since our trailer's washer had broken the previous winter and we couldn't afford to fix it. Tommy would bring library books and read aloud to me while we waited for the cycles to finish. He'd become an excellent reader, partly because books were free entertainment, but also because he genuinely loved stories. Sundays were our day off, or as close to one as we could manage. We'd pack peanut butter sandwiches and walk to the city park where Tommy could run off energy while David worked on strengthening exercises, using the playground equipment as makeshift physical therapy tools. Other families would arrive in SUVs with coolers full of elaborate picnics, but Tommy never seemed to notice the disparity. He was too busy chasing butterflies, or building stick houses, or convincing other kids to join his elaborate imaginary game. The money was always a puzzle that required constant solving. Rent was $650 for our 2-bedroom trailer, not cheap, but the cheapest option we could find that wasn't completely unsafe. David's medical bills had been partially covered by workers' compensation, but the bureaucratic maze of insurance claims and appeals meant we were constantly fighting for benefits while bills accumulated interest. I'd learned to shop exclusively from clearance racks and markdown bins. Tuesday afternoons, The grocery store marked down meat that was approaching its sell-by date. I'd buy what we could afford and freeze it immediately. Wednesday mornings, the bakery put day-old bread on sale for 50 cents a loaf. Saturday evenings, some stores marked down produce that wouldn't last through the weekend. Our entertainment budget was zero, but we found free alternatives. The library had story time for Tommy and computer access for David's coursework. The community center offered free family swim nights twice a month. The city hosted outdoor movies in the park during summer, and we'd bring our own blanket and shared popcorn from home. Tommy's clothing came exclusively from thrift stores and hand-me-downs from David's sister's kids. I'd gotten skilled at basic alterations, hemming pants and taking in shirts so they fit properly. Tommy never complained, even when classmates occasionally commented on his weird clothes. He'd just shrug and say something like, "My mom says clothes are just costumes for your body, and what's inside is what matters." The hardest nights were when unexpected expenses hit. Tommy needing new shoes because his old ones had holes, or David's prescription changing and costing more than budgeted, or the trailer's heating breaking in January and requiring a repair we couldn't afford to delay. Those nights I'd sit at our kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of overdue notices, moving numbers around like puzzle pieces, trying to find combinations that would keep us afloat for another month. Sometimes there was no solution that worked. I'd have to call the electric company to arrange a payment plan, or ask our landlord for a few extra days, or swallow my pride and accept help from David's family. Good people who were struggling themselves but always found a way to share what little extra they had. The absolute worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion, or the constant financial stress. It was the isolation. Our old friends had gradually disappeared as we could no longer afford to go out for dinners or movies. David's work friends had tried to stay connected at first, but there's only so long you can maintain relationships when you can't reciprocate invitations or participate in activities that cost money. David's family remained close, but they lived 2 hours away and had their own challenges. My mother had been gone for almost a decade, and Dad's family had made it clear I wasn't welcome unless absolutely necessary. Some nights, after Tommy was asleep and David was resting, I'd sit on our trailer's tiny front steps and feel the weight of being solely responsible for holding everything together. No backup plan, no safety net, no one to call if I got sick or hurt and couldn't work. Those were the nights I'd let myself cry quietly, just for a few minutes, before going back inside to prepare for another 3:45 a.m. alarm. But there were also moments of unexpected grace. Tommy bringing me dandelions he'd picked on his walk home from school. David successfully completing a particularly difficult assignment for his bookkeeping course. A stranger at the grocery store letting us cut in line because they could see Tommy was tired. Small kindnesses that reminded me the world still contained goodness. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, things had begun to improve. David's legs were getting stronger, not enough for construction work but enough that he could walk short distances with a cane. His bookkeeping skills were developing, and he'd started handling the books for 2 small local businesses. The extra income wasn't much, but it meant we could occasionally buy Tommy new socks or afford the name brand cereal he loved. I'd also started taking online courses toward my GED, studying by flashlight after everyone was asleep so I wouldn't disturb them. It was slow progress. Sometimes weeks would pass where I was too exhausted to focus on coursework, but I was learning. Math concepts I'd never understood in high school were finally clicking. Essay writing was coming naturally. The plan, tentative and fragile, was for me to eventually take community college classes, maybe become a nurse or teacher, something with better pay and more stability than cleaning offices and loading trucks. David could continue building his bookkeeping business from home. Tommy could grow up seeing his parents work toward better futures, not just survive day to day. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was ours, built on the foundation of small daily choices to keep going, keep trying, keep believing that effort eventually pays off. When Dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 8 months ago, I'd felt an unexpected surge of grief, not just for the relationship we'd never had, but for the possibility that we'd never have one. I'd written him a letter, the first in years, telling him about Tommy's progress in school, David's recovery, my own educational goal. I'd asked if he'd like to visit, to finally meet his grandson properly. He'd never responded to the letter, but the next month's check was larger than usual. It felt like acknowledgement, maybe even pride, though I might have been reading too much into a simple increase in the amount. When he died 2 weeks ago,
I'd attended the funeral and sat in the back holding Tommy's hand as he whispered questions about heaven and angels. Dad's family had nodded politely but maintained their distance. I hadn't expected anything different, which was why sitting in that law office, listening to Victoria mock my thrift store dress and trailer park address, felt like the continuation of a familiar pattern, just another reminder that in their eyes, I'd always be the embarrassing mistake Dad had tried to manage from a distance. I'd prepared myself for a token inheritance, maybe a few $1,000s, enough for them to say they'd done their duty. I'd even prepared Tommy explaining that Grandpa's other family might say unkind things, but that didn't reflect on our worth as people. What I hadn't prepared for was discovering that the man who'd kept me at arm's length for 32 years, had been watching carefully enough to see who I'd become despite or perhaps because of every obstacle he'd allowed me to face alone. Walking into Morrison, Klein & Associates, that Tuesday morning felt like stepping into a museum of my own inadequacy. Every detail of the office seemed designed to remind people like me that we didn't belong. The receptionist's polite but cold greeting, the artwork that probably cost more than our yearly rent, the way sound seemed muffled by expensive carpeting and privilege. The waiting area could have housed our entire trailer with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's financial district. I'd cleaned offices in some of those buildings, arriving before dawn to empty trash cans and scrub toilets for people who worked behind those gleaming windows. Tommy pressed close to my side, his eyes wide as he took in the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Everything was polished to perfection, smelling of leather polish and success. Even the magazines on the coffee table were ones I'd never heard of, financial publications and luxury lifestyle guides, that might as well have been written in foreign languages. "Mommy," Tommy whispered, "is this like a castle?" Before I could answer, Victoria's voice cut through the hushed atmosphere like broken glass. "Oh my God, she actually came, and she brought the child." She swept into the waiting area like she owned it, which given her family's relationship with the law firm she probably did. Her designer suit was the color of champagne, perfectly tailored to her tall frame. Her jewelry caught the light from the chandeliers, and her makeup was so flawless it looked professionally applied. Behind her came Marcus, slightly out of breath as if he'd hurried to catch up. He'd grown soft in the years since I'd last seen him, his expensive clothes doing little to hide the consequences of too many business lunches and too little actual work. His eyes swept over my appearance with barely concealed disgust. "Emma," he said, making my name sound like a profanity. Interesting choice of attire. I'd worn my best dress, a navy blue shirt dress I'd bought secondhand, but that fit well and looked professional. With my thrift store blazer and the good shoes I saved for job interviews, I'd thought I looked respectable. But standing next to Victoria's effortless elegance, I felt like a child playing dress-up in grown-up clothes. Dad's wife Eleanor made her entrance like a queen holding court. At 68, she'd maintained the kind of refined beauty that comes from never having worried about money. Her silver hair was swept into a perfect chignon, and her black Chanel suit probably cost more than I'd made in 6 months. Her eyes found mine across the room, and I saw the familiar calculation there, the quick assessment that placed me firmly in the category of problems to be managed, rather than people to be acknowledged. "Emma," her voice was arctic, "how unexpected to see you." I wasn't aware Richard had made any provisions for external family members. External family members, as if I were some distant cousin rather than her husband's daughter. Brad, Victoria's husband, completed the gathering. He'd barely glanced at me before returning to his phone, scrolling through emails with the bored expression of someone who'd expected this to be a routine distribution of assets. His Rolex caught the light as he typed, a casual display of wealth that probably exceeded our annual income. The family settled into their chairs with the easy confidence of people accustomed to owning every room they entered. I took the remaining seat, Tommy climbing into my lap since there wasn't a chair small enough for him. The contrast was stark and intentional. They belonged here. I was visiting from a world they'd rather not acknowledge existed. "So," Victoria said, crossing her legs with calculated grace, "I assume you've arranged for childcare after this. This isn't really an appropriate environment for children." The implication was clear. Serious business was about to be conducted, and my presence, let alone Tommy's, was an unwelcome complication in their family affairs. Tommy, who'd been quietly observing the adults, suddenly tugged on my sleeve. "Mommy, why is that lady so shiny?" he whispered, not understanding that his stage whisper was easily heard across the room. Victoria's smile was razor sharp. "At least he's observant. Does he ask about everything he doesn't understand? The condescension in her voice made my jaw clench, but I kept my expression neutral. He's 6, curiosity is age appropriate. Eleanor's tone suggested she found my parenting as inadequate as my wardrobe. Richard always said structure and proper guidance were essential for children's development. I hope you're providing adequate supervision. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Supervision, as if I were some negligent parent rather than someone who'd sacrificed everything to provide for my child. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting to what he probably thought was friendly concern. Speaking of guidance, Emma, I hope you understand that whatever Dad left you, and I'm sure it's something thoughtful, you'll want to be careful about management. Money can be complicated when you're not used to handling. We'd be happy to help, Victoria added, her tone suggesting this was a generous offer rather than an insult. Our financial advisors are excellent, they could help you avoid mistakes. The patronizing kindness was almost worse than outright hostility. At least hostility was on. Tommy shifted in my lap, his child's intuition picking up on the tension in the room even if he didn't understand its source. He leaned back against me, a silent reminder that whatever happened in the next hour, I had someone depending on me to handle it with dignity. Miss Klein's secretary appeared in the doorway, her expression professionally neutral. Mr. Klein is ready for you now. The family rose as one, Victoria smoothing her skirt, Eleanor adjusting her purse strap, Marcus straightening his tie. They moved toward the conference room with the confidence of people who'd attended many such meetings, people for whom inheritance was a familiar process of transferring wealth from one generation to the next. I stood more slowly, Tommy's hand finding mine automatic. My palms were slightly damp, and I could feel my heart beating faster than normal. This was their world, their ritual, their language. I was about to learn what 32 years of being the family's embarrassing secret had earned me in my father's final account. As we filed into the conference room, more mahogany, more leather, more reminders of privilege, Victoria leaned close to Brad and whispered something that made him chuckle. Marcus was already calculating something on his phone. Eleanor took her seat at the head of the table as if it were her natural position. I guided Tommy to the chair beside mine, helping him climb up so he could see over the table's polished surface. He looked so small in this room full of adults who'd already decided he didn't matter. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was about to learn what my father thought I was worth, surrounded by people who'd spent decades making sure I knew they thought I was worth nothing at all. Mr. Klein entered carrying a thick folder, his expression grave with the weight of documents that would reshape relationships and reveal final truths. He took his place at the opposite end of the table from Eleanor, creating a sort of formal triangle with the family arranged around the edges.
Before we begin, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news, I want to note that Mr. Morrison was very specific about the order in which these bequests should be announced. He also left several sealed envelopes with instructions about their contents. Victoria and Marcus exchanged glances. Eleanor's expression remained perfectly controlled. But I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested this wasn't following the script she'd expected. I kept my hands folded in my lap, Tommy's small fingers intertwined with mine. Whatever came next, we'd face it together just like we'd faced everything else. Mr. Klein adjusted his reading glasses and opened the thick folder with the deliberate care of someone who understood he was about to detonate several lives simultaneously. The last will and testament of Richard James Morrison, he began, his voice carrying the weight of legal finality. Mr. Morrison was very specific about the order of these announcements, and I'm bound by his instructions to follow them precisely. Eleanor straightened in her chair, the gesture of someone preparing to accept what was rightfully hers. Victoria had pulled out her phone, probably ready to text friends about whatever properties she was about to inherit. Marcus was leaning back with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted his position as the golden son. First, Miss Klein continued, to Eleanor Morrison, my wife of 35 years, I leave the family home at 137 Hillcrest Drive, along with all furnishings and personal effects contained therein. I also bequeath the trust fund established in 1995, currently valued at approximately $2.8 million. Eleanor nodded graciously, as if accepting a compliment on her appearance rather than a fortune. Richard was always thoughtful about security, she murmured. To Victoria Morrison Hayes, my daughter, I leave the vacation properties in Aspen, Colorado, and Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, along with the trust fund established in her name in 1988, currently valued at approximately $1.6 million. Victoria's smile was radiant. Daddy always said the Aspen house would be mine someday. I've already been thinking about renovation. To Marcus Morrison, my son, I leave Morrison Construction Company, including all equipment, contracts and business assets, along with the commercial real estate portfolio consisting of 12 properties in the downtown district. Marcus sat up straighter, his expression shifting to something approaching respect for his deceased father. About time, he muttered. I've got plans to turn that company around, make it profitable again. The room buzzed with satisfied murmur. The inheritance was proceeding exactly as expected, the legitimate family receiving the bulk of the estate, assets distributed according to traditional hierarchies and relationships. I felt Tommy shift beside me, his child's attention wandering as the adults discussed numbers and properties that meant nothing to him. I squeezed his hand gently, wondering if Dad had left me anything at all, or if this whole meeting was just Eleanor's way of demonstrating my place in the family order one final time. Mr. Klein cleared his throat, and something in his tone made the room fall quiet again. Now we come to additional bequests, he said, his eyes moving to meet mine for the first time since he'd begun reading. To Emma Morrison Chen, my daughter, the room's atmosphere shifted instantly. Victoria's smile froze. Marcus looked up from his phone. Eleanor's gracious expression hardened into something more calculating. I leave the following assets, with the stipulation that they are hers free and clear, with no conditions or restrictions attached. He paused, consulting his documents, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. First, the private savings account held at First National Bank, currently containing $2.3 million. The silence in the room was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents. Victoria's face went white, then Marcus shot to his feet so quickly his chair rolled backward. That's impossible, he said, his voice cracking slightly. There must be some mistake. But Mr. Klein continued in the same steady tone. Second, the investment portfolio managed by Goldman Sachs, consisting of stocks, bonds and mutual funds, currently valued at approximately $8.7 million. Eleanor made a sound like air being let out of a balloon. Victoria's phone clattered to the table as her hands began to shake. Third, the property at 137 Oakwood Drive. Wait, Victoria interrupted, her voice sharp with panic. That's impossible. We didn't even know he owned property on Oakwood Drive, currently valued at $1.8 million. Mr. Klein finished calmly. A 4-bedroom colonial home purchased 18 months ago, fully furnished and mortgage-free. The numbers were surreal, floating in the air like something from a dream. $11 million. $11 million plus a house I'd never seen in a neighborhood where I'd never imagined living. But Mr. Klein wasn't finished. Fourth, Emma Morrison Chen is named as the primary beneficiary of the life insurance policy, with a payout value of $5 million. Marcus was pacing now, his face purple with rage or shock. This is insane. She's never had anything to do with the family business. She doesn't know the first thing about managing money. And finally, Mr. Klein's voice cut through Marcus's protest. Emma Morrison Chen inherits full ownership of Morrison Holdings, the parent company that owns and controls all subsidiary businesses, including Morrison Construction, Morrison Property Management, Morrison Investments, and Morrison Development, along with all associated assets. Contran Holdings. The room exploded. This is fraud, Victoria shrieked, her composure completely shattered. She can't inherit the parent company. That makes her your boss, Mr. Klein said quietly. Eleanor's voice was deadly calm. Richard wasn't thinking clearly at the end. The cancer, the medications, he obviously wasn't competent to make decisions of this magnitude. Marcus was pulling out his phone. We're calling our lawyers right now. This will never hold up in court. Victoria was standing now, her designer suit wrinkled, her perfect makeup streaked with tears of rage. This is insane. She's lived in a trailer park for years. What could she possibly know about running a multi-million-dollar company? She'll destroy everything Dad built. The attacks were coming from all sides now, voices raised in anger and desperation, but through the chaos, I heard Tommy's small voice, confused and hurt. Mommy, are these the mean people again? The innocence in my son's question, The simple, devastating accuracy of it seemed to puncture something in the room's frantic energy. Here was this beautiful 6-year-old child, witnessing adults behave like vultures, and his only confusion was whether these were the same mean people he'd learned to navigate at previous family gatherings. Something shifted inside me. Maybe it was 32 years of swallowed pride finally demanding space to breathe. Maybe it was the realization that I was now in a position where I didn't have to take their cruelty anymore. Or maybe it was just a mother's instinct to protect her child from witnessing any more ugliness. I stood up slowly, still holding Tommy's hand, and the room gradually fell silent. "You want to know what I know about money?" My voice was steady, which surprised me. "I know what it's like to choose between groceries and medicine. I know what it's like to work 3 jobs, and still wonder if the lights will get shut off. I know what it's like to tell your child you can't afford the field trip all his classmates are going on." Victoria opened her mouth to interrupt, but I held up my free hand. "I know what $1 is actually worth because I've had to stretch each one until it breaks. I know the difference between needs and wants, because I've lived years where wants were a luxury I couldn't afford. I know the value of hard work because I've been doing it since I was 14, cleaning office buildings after school, while you were getting your allowance for breathing." My voice was getting stronger, years of suppressed truth finally finding air. "You want to talk about competition? I've managed to keep my family fed, housed and together on $20,000 a year. You've blown through millions and run Dad's company into the ground. Marcus, your construction division has lost money for 3 consecutive years. Victoria, your trust fund has been supplemented 6 times because you spent the principal on shopping trips and spa weekends." Marcus tried to interject. "Now wait, No, you wait." The authority in my voice surprised even me. "For 32 years, I've listened to all of you act like my existence was some embarrassing mistake Dad made. Like my mother was worthless because she waited tables instead of coming from old money. Like I was somehow less than because I grew up poor." I looked directly at Ellen. "You've spent 3 decades making sure I knew I wasn't welcome at family gatherings, wasn't worth Dad's time, wasn't really part of this family. You treated my mother like she was nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed with monthly payment." My voice caught slightly, but I pushed through. "When Mom was dying of cancer, she asked me to call and invite Dad to visit her one last time. She wanted to make peace, to thank him for the checks that kept us afloat. Your secretary told me he was too busy with family obligations to visit a dying woman." Eleanor's face had gone pale, but her jaw remained set in defiance. "When Tommy was born, I sent pictures and a birth announcement. I thought maybe having a grandson might soften his heart, might make him want to be part of our lives." The response was a typed note, not even handwritten, congratulating me on the baby. Like Tommy was some generic infant rather than his own grandchild. I turned to Marcus and Victoria. "You two have had every advantage money can buy. Private schools, college tuition paid in full, trust funds, connections, opportunities handed to you on silver platters. And what did you do with all of that privilege? You became entitled, lazy and cruel. You've never worked a real day in your lives, never struggled for anything, never had to prove your worth through anything other than the accident of your birth." Victoria was crying now, but they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of rage and humiliation. "Meanwhile," I continued, "I've spent my adult life proving myself every single day, proving I was worth loving to David, proving I was worth hiring to every employer who looked at my address and wondered if someone from the trailer park could be trusted, proving I was a good mother to Tommy, despite having no examples of what good parenting looked like from Dad's side of the family." My voice softened, but didn't lose its steel. I never asked him for more than he was willing to give, never demanded recognition or inclusion, never expected fairness. I just lived my life as best I could with the hand I was dealt. I looked around the room at their shocked faces, but apparently Dad was paying attention after all. While you were taking your trust funds and family name for granted, he was watching me build something from nothing. While you were assuming your inheritance was guaranteed by birthright, he was evaluating who actually embodied the values he claimed to believe in. Tommy tugged on my dress. "Mommy, you sound different." I knelt down to his level. "How do I sound, sweetheart?" "Strong," he said simply. "Like when you carry all the grocery bags at once." I smiled at him, then stood back up to face the room. "You want to challenge the will? Go ahead. But understand what you're really challenging. You're not just questioning Dad's final wishes, you're questioning whether someone who's proven themselves through adversity deserves recognition over people who've proven nothing, except their ability to spend money they didn't earn. Mr. Klein cleared his throat. There's actually more, he said quietly. Mr. Morrison left specific instructions, that if there were challenges to the will's validity, I should read the following letter aloud. He pulled out a sealed envelope, opened it carefully, and began to read in Richard Morrison's own words. To my family, if you're hearing this letter, it means you've chosen to attack Emma, rather than accept my final wishes. Let me be very clear about why I made these decisions. The room fell completely silent. Emma is the only one of my children who inherited my work ethic and values. While Victoria and Marcus have lived off family money their entire lives, Emma has built character through struggle. I have been quietly monitoring Emma's life for years through private investigators and careful observation. Victoria made a strangled sound. Marcus slumped in his chair. I watched her graduate high school while working nights to help support her mother. I watched her care for her dying mother without asking me for additional help, even when I knew they were struggling to pay medical bills. I watched her build a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine love, not social advantage. The letter continued. I watched her sacrifice her own educational goals to support her husband after his accident, never once complaining or asking for more than I chose to give. I watched her work multiple jobs while maintaining her dignity and raising her son to be kind, respectful, and hardworking. My eyes filled with tears as I realized Dad had been watching, had been paying attention to all the moments I thought I was facing alone. Victoria and Marcus, you have been given every advantage money can buy, and you have squandered opportunities Emma would have treasured. You have shown no interest in the values that built this family's wealth: hard work, sacrifice, integrity, perseverance. Emma has shown nothing but those values despite being given no advantages at all. The lawyer paused, looking around the room. There's more. I made mistakes as a father. I was a coward who let pride and social pressure keep me from claiming Emma publicly as my daughter. I was afraid of Eleanor's reaction, afraid of social judgment, afraid of disrupting the life I'd built with my legitimate family. That fear caused me to abandon a child who deserved better. Eleanor's face was stone, but I could see the fury building behind her eyes. Emma never asked me for more than I was willing to give, but I should have given her everything she deserved. My name, my recognition, my presence at her important moments. I failed her as a father, but she succeeded as a daughter despite my failure. The letter's final paragraph hit like a physical blow. Emma, if you're hearing this, it means they've shown their true colors once again. You owe them nothing. This inheritance comes with no strings, no expectations, that you maintain relationships with people who have consistently treated you as lesser. Use this money to build the life you and your family deserve, free from the judgment and cruelty of people who mistake wealth for worth. The letter ended with, I love you, Emma. I always did. I just never had the courage to say it while I was alive. I hope it's not too late for you to hear it now. Your father, Richard Morrison. By the time Miss Klein finished reading, I was crying openly, and Tommy had climbed into my lap to hug me. Don't cry, Mommy, he whispered. Happy tears are okay. And for the first time in 32 years, they were happy tears, tears of relief, recognition, and a love finally acknowledged, even if it came too late for the man who'd written those words. The aftermath was swift and vicious. Victoria was the first to break, her composure completely shattered. This is insane, she screamed, her voice echoing off the conference room's mahogany walls. She doesn't deserve any of this. She's nobody. Her mother was a waitress. She lunged forward as if she might physically attack me, but Brad caught her arm, though his own face was twisted with rage. Vicky, calm down. We'll fight this in court. Court? Victoria spun on him. With what money? Our trust funds just became pocket change, compared to what she's inheriting. Marcus had gone completely silent, but his face had turned an alarming shade of purple. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. You realize what you've done, don't you, Emma? You've destroyed this family. Dad built something, and you're going to tear it all down because you don't have the first clue what you're doing. The family was destroyed long before today, I replied, my voice steadier than I'd expected. It was destroyed the moment you all decided that loving someone was conditional on their bank account. Eleanor stood slowly, her movements controlled but her eyes blazing with decades of suppressed fury. You think this changes anything? You think money makes you one of us? You're still the same trailer park girl who doesn't belong in our world. You're right, I said, standing to meet her gaze. I don't belong in your world.
Your world is built on cruelty and entitlement. I wouldn't want to belong there. That's when Eleanor showed her true color. You little gold-digging whore, she hissed, her refined facade finally cracking completely. Just like your mother, at least she had the decency to stay away from family function. The words hit like a slap, but before I could respond, Tommy's small voice cut through the venom. You're not allowed to call my mommy mean names. His 6-year-old indignation was so pure, so protective, that it seemed to highlight just how ugly the adults in the room had become. Eleanor's face twisted with even more rage. Don't you dare speak to me, you little. Stop. My voice cracked like a whip. Don't you dare speak to my son like that. I stood up, lifting Tommy into my arms. Mr. Klein, I assume there are papers to sign. Yes, but they can be handled at a later date. Perhaps it would be best to. No. I looked around the room at these people who'd spent 32 years making me feel small. I want this finished now. Marcus tried one last desperate gambit. Look, Emma, we got off to a bad start here, but we're family. Maybe we can work something out. You don't really want to run a company, right? Maybe I could handle the day-to-day operations, and we could split the profits. Keep it in the family. The offer was so transparently self-serving, it was almost laughable. No, Marcus, and just so we're clear, you're fired. Effective immediately, his face went from pale to purple again. You can't fire me. I'm family. I've been running Morrison Construction for. Into the ground. Security will escort you out of the building tomorrow morning. Your company car, credit cards, and office access will be terminated by end of business today. Victoria tried a different approach, her voice taking on the wheedling tone she'd probably used to manipulate Dad for decades. Emma, please, we can work this out. We don't have to be enemies. Maybe we just got off on the wrong foot today. This is emotional for all of us. You're right, it is emotional, I replied. I'm feeling 32 years of suppressed anger, and it feels incredibly liberating. I turned to Mr. Klein. I'll need those papers, recommendations, for financial advisors Dad trusted, and a complete audit of all business operations, particularly Morrison Construction's books. Marcus shot to his feet. You can't audit my books, those are confidential. Not anymore, it's my company now. Eleanor made one final attempt to maintain control. Richard would be ashamed of the person you're becoming. This greed, this vindictiveness. It's not who he'd want you to be. For the first time all day I smiled, really smiled. You're absolutely right. He'd be ashamed that it took me 32 years to stand up for myself and my son. I headed toward the door, Tommy still in my arms, then paused to look back at the 3 people who'd made my childhood exercise in feeling inadequate. Oh, and one more thing. The monthly checks stopped today. All of them. You're going to learn what it feels like to live on what you've actually earned instead of what you inherited. Victoria's gasp was audible. You can't be serious. Our trust funds won't cover. Your trust funds will cover exactly what they always covered. I interrupt. The difference is, there won't be any supplements from Morrison Holdings. When you overspend, you'll have to learn to live within your means, just like everyone else. Brad finally spoke up, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. This is financial warfare. You're trying to destroy us. No, I said, settling Tommy more comfortably on my hip. I'm just not subsidizing your destruction of yourselves anymore. As we walked out of the conference room, I could hear the explosion of voices behind us, accusations, desperate planning, threats of legal action. But for the first time in my life, their opinions felt irrelevant. Tommy pressed his face against my shoulder as we walked through the law firm's elegant lobby. Mommy, are we rich now? Yes, sweetheart. But more importantly, we're in the elevator. As the doors closed on the sounds of the Morrison family's meltdown, Tommy looked up at me with his serious 6-year-old eyes. Does this mean we don't have to be scared of the mean people anymore? No, baby, we never have to be scared of them again. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened faster than I dared to imagine possible. The first call I made from the law firm's parking lot was to David. He answered on the second ring, probably wondering why I was calling in the middle of the afternoon. How did it go? He asked, his voice carrying the careful optimism of someone who'd learned not to hope for too much. David, I said, my voice shaking with the magnitude of what I was about to tell him. We're not going to have to worry about money anymore. What do you mean? Did he leave you some? He left me everything. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, Emma, what are you talking about? I explained as best I could, watching Tommy play with a dandelion he'd found in the parking lot, while I tried to make sense of numbers that still felt surreal. $16 million in cash and investments, a house I'd never seen, a company that apparently controlled most of Dad's business empire. Jesus, David whispered when I finished. Emma, are you sure this is real? I'm holding the papers. Miss Klein is arranging for security at our trailer tonight. Apparently wealthy people sometimes face threats when inheritance disputes get ugly. Security? At our trailer? David laughed, but it sounded slightly hysterical. This morning I was worried about making rent, and now you're talking about security guards. I know it's overwhelming. Overwhelming doesn't begin to cover it. He paused and I could hear him processing. What do we do now? First I'm taking Tommy to see our new house. Then we're going to the hospital to get you the best medical team money can buy. Within 3 days, David was admitted to the city's premier rehabilitation center, where a team of specialists began aggressive treatment protocols that insurance had previously deemed experimental, and therefore uncovered. Rodriguez, the neurologist who became his primary physician, was optimistic about David's chances for increased mobility. The first year after a spinal injury is critical, she explained during our consultation. But even 3 years out, with the right interventions, we can often see significant improvement. The procedures were expensive, the kind of expensive that would have been impossible on our old budget. But Dr. Rodriguez was confident that combination of surgical intervention and intensive therapy could restore function David had assumed was lost forever. While David began his treatment, Tommy and I moved into the house on Oakwood Drive. The first time we pulled into the driveway of 1227 Oakwood Drive, Tommy's eyes went wide with wonder. We live here now? He asked in amazement. It was a beautiful colonial, painted sage green with white trim and surrounded by mature oak trees that gave the street its name. The front porch had a swing that Tommy immediately claimed as his reading spot. Inside, the house was furnished with the kind of tasteful, comfortable furniture I'd only seen in magazines. Nothing ostentatious, but everything quality. The best part was Tommy's reaction to his new bedroom. It was twice the size of our entire trailer with built-in bookshelves, a window seat, overlooking the backyard, and space for all the toys he'd never had room for before. Mommy, he said, spinning in the middle of the empty floor, I can do cartwheels in here. But the real transformation began when I walked into Morrison Holdings for the first time as its owner. The building was a gleaming glass tower in the heart of the business district, the same district where I'd cleaned offices for years, arriving before dawn to empty trash cans and scrub toilets for people who worked behind those windows. Now I walked through the front lobby as the owner, my heels clicking on marble floors I'd once mopped on my hands and knees. The executive floor was all mahogany and leather, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. My office, was larger than most people's apartments, with a conference table that could seat 20 and a desk that probably cost more than our old annual income. But it was the employees' reactions that surprised me most. I'd expected resistance, skepticism, maybe even hostility from people who'd worked under Marcus for years. Instead, I found relief. Janet Morrison, no relation, despite the name, the company's chief financial officer, was the first to approach me honestly about the business's real situation.
Mrs. Chen, she said during our first meeting, I hope you'll forgive me for being direct, but this company has been hemorrhaging money for 3 years. Your father knew it, but Marcus refused to acknowledge the problems. She spread financial reports across the conference table, pointing to patterns I was beginning to understand. Bad contracts, cost overruns, projects abandoned halfway through. The construction division alone has lost $2.3 million since Marcus took over management. What would you recommend? I asked. Janet looked surprised. You're asking my opinion? You're the CFO. It's your job to have opinions about the company's financial health. Marcus never wanted to hear recommendations that didn't align with his plans, she said carefully. Your father did, but toward the end, Marcus was making most of the day-to-day decisions. Over the following weeks, Janet became my guide into the business world I'd never imagined entering. She introduced me to department heads, who'd been waiting years for someone to actually listen to their concerns. The company's problems were serious but fixable. Poor leadership had created inefficiencies, not fundamental flaws in the business model. I hired Dr. Chen. Again, no relation, as an external consultant to evaluate company operations. Her recommendations were comprehensive: streamline management, invest in updated equipment, focus on profitable sectors while eliminating money-losing ventures. The hardest decision was what to do about the employees Marcus had hired, many of them friends or drinking buddies rather than qualified professionals. Some I had to let go, but others just needed proper training and clear expectation. Miguel Santos, the construction foreman who'd worked for Dad since the early days, became my most valuable advisor. Your father, he knew construction, Miguel told me during one of our site visits. He started with nothing, worked his way up. He understood that good work takes time, costs money up front, but pays back in reputation. Marcus, he only saw dollar signs. Miguel taught me to read blueprints, to understand project timelines, to recognize quality workmanship. More importantly, he taught me how to talk to the crews, how to earn their respect through knowledge rather than just ownership. You remind me of your father when he was young, Miguel said one afternoon as we watched a crew installing windows in a residential project. He asked questions, wanted to understand every part of the business. Marcus, he just wanted to tell people what to do without knowing why. Within 6 months, Morrison Holdings was profitable again. Not massively, but steadily, sustainably. We'd shed the deadweight projects, focused on our core competencies, and invested in the people and equipment that could deliver quality work on time and on budget. The most unexpected support came from people I'd worked with in my old life. When word got around about my inheritance, and in a city this size, word always gets around, I expected awkwardness, maybe resentment. Instead, Maria Santos, whose offices I'd cleaned for 2 years, stopped by Morrison Holdings to congratulate me. I always knew you were special, she said, sitting in my executive office like it was the most natural thing in the world. The way you worked, always professional, always thorough. You treated my business like it mattered, even when you were just the cleaning lady. She paused, looking around at the mahogany and leather. This is where you belong, Emma. Not because of the money, but because of who you are. Dr. Patricia Williams, whose dental office I'd cleaned, sent a fruit basket with a note. Congratulations on your success. You always brightened our office with your positive attitude and work ethic. We're not surprised to see you succeeding in whatever you put your mind to. Even Tony Ramirez, the warehouse supervisor from my early morning stocking job, called to congratulate me. You were the hardest worker I ever supervised, he said. Never complained, never cut corners, always on time. If anyone deserved a break like this, it was you. But the best support came from David's progress. After 3 months of intensive treatment, he walked into Tommy's parent-teacher conference, using only a lightweight cane. The teacher, Mrs. Johnson, didn't know about David's accident. She just saw an involved father asking thoughtful questions about his son's education. Driving home that night, David reached over and took my hand. You know what the best part of all this is, he said. What? It's not the money. It's watching you become who you were always meant to be. I squeezed his hand, understanding what he meant. The woman who'd sat in that law office, accepting insults from people who thought I was less than them, felt like a different person, not because money had changed my fundamental character, but because it had given me the security to let my real strength show. I think I'm finally growing into myself, I said. No, David replied, smiling. You're finally in a position where other people can see who you've always been. 1 year later, Tommy and I were sitting on the porch swing of our house on Oakwood Drive, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. David was inside, walking without assistance now as he prepared dinner for us, a simple pleasure we'd never take for granted again. The house had become a home in ways that had nothing to do with its size or value. Tommy's art projects covered the refrigerator. David's physical therapy equipment shared space with my business books in the study. The formal dining room had become Tommy's homework space, where he spread out school projects on the mahogany table that had probably once hosted important business meetings. We'd kept the house comfortable but not ostentatious. The furniture was nice but not museum quality. Tommy still made his own peanut butter sandwiches, and was responsible for feeding our new dog, a rescue mutt named Charlie, who'd been returned to the shelter 3 times for being too energetic. In our house, Charlie fit right in. Mom. Tommy's voice was soft, thoughtful in the way that always meant he'd been processing something important. Yes, sweetheart. Remember when those people were mean to us at the lawyer place? I remember. The scene still replayed in my mind sometimes, though with less pain and more perspective than before. I remember. Tommy was quiet for a moment, watching the firefly. At 7 now he'd grown thoughtful in the way children do when they've witnessed adult complexity they're still learning to understand. Were they sad because Grandpa gave us his love instead of them? The question hit me like gentle lightning, the kind of insight that only comes from a child's ability to cut through all the complicated adult explanations and find the simple truth underneath. I paused, struck by his perspective. In all my analysis of family dynamics and generational wealth and business decisions, I'd missed what Tommy saw clearly. Dad's inheritance hadn't just been about money, it had been about love, finally expressed in the only way he'd known how. You know what, Tommy? I think you're exactly right. He nodded solemnly, then brightened with the resilience that children possess. Well, that's silly of them. There's enough love for everyone. They just had to be nice to get some. As the stars began to appear overhead, I realized that Tommy had articulated something I'd been trying to understand for months. Dad's greatest gift wasn't the money. It was finally definitively proving that love isn't measured by what you're given, but by what you choose to build with whatever you have. Victoria, Marcus and Eleanor had been given everything: wealth, privilege, security, social position, but they'd built nothing meaningful with those advantages, except entitlement and cruelty. David and I had started with almost nothing, and we'd built a marriage based on mutual respect, a family centered on love, and a life that had meaning even when it was difficult. The money had simply given us the tools to build more comfortably. Tommy, I said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead, do you know what makes someone rich? He considered the question seriously. Having lots of money, that's one kind of rich, but there's another kind. The kind where you have people who love you and people you love back, where you've learned to find joy in small things, where you know the difference between what you need and what you want. Tommy thought about this, like how we were rich even in the trailer because we had each other. Exactly like that. He leaned against my shoulder and I wrapped my arm around him. The mean people didn't understand that kind of rich, did they? No, sweetheart, they didn't. That's really sad, he said with the matter-of-fact sympathy of childhood. Maybe someday they'll figure it out. David appeared in the doorway, using his cane but moving with the confident stride of someone who'd reclaimed his independence. Dinner's ready, he called, and Charlie's trying to steal the bread rolls again. As we headed inside, Tommy suddenly stopped and looked up at me. Mommy, do you think Grandpa can see us now? Do you think he knows we're happy? I thought about the grandfather Tommy had barely known, the father who'd spent 32 years loving me from a distance because he was too afraid to do it openly. About the man who'd watched me through private investigators but never learned to watch me with his own eyes. About the final letter that had said everything he'd never been brave enough to say while alive. I think he does, I said finally. And I think he's proud of the family we've built. Tommy smiled and ran ahead into the house, already distracted by Charlie's antics and the promise of David's homemade mac and cheese. I lingered on the threshold for a moment, looking back at the fireflies still dancing in our yard. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, business decisions, investment meetings, the ongoing responsibility of managing wealth I was still learning to understand. Victoria and Marcus had eventually dropped their legal challenges, but they'd never speak to me again. Eleanor had moved to Florida, taking her bitterness with her like matched luggage. But tonight I was simply a mother and wife, watching fireflies with my son and coming in to dinner with my husband. The fundamentals hadn't changed, even if the setting was more comfortable. The mean people could keep their bitterness and their sense of entitlement. We had chosen joy instead, gratitude instead of grievance, love instead of fear. Tommy fell asleep that night, curled up between David and me, Charlie snoring at the foot of the bed. As I listened to the quiet sounds of my family's breathing, I understood that this quiet moment of peace with the people I loved most, hard-won and carefully protected, was worth more than all the Morrison family pride combined. The money was nice, the security was wonderful, the ability to help David heal and give Tommy opportunities was transformative. But the real inheritance had been the lesson Dad had finally managed to teach me, that love when it's real doesn't come with conditions or expiration date. It might come late, wrapped in regret and delivered through lawyers, but when it finally arrives, it changes everything. And that made all the difference.